Thank you.
Great.
All right, so we're going to give folks just a couple of moments. There we go.
So, Andrea, I also, in the Q&A, depending on the questions that come up, please, and maybe Wally, you can put it in, but you have a book out, right? So maybe we should highlight your book too. Like maybe we can put that in the chat for people to kind of know. So don't feel bad giving a shameless plug, right? Like this is what this is about: women's empowerment and us having the critical conversations that need to be had. And if you're doing something rock star, kick ass, awesome, then like talk about it, right?
I appreciate that.
What's your title, Andrea?
The book, oh girl, listen, I'll be honest with you, I always forget. It's Racial Coalition Building in Local Elections. Oh, Wally put it in the chat. I never remember the second part because here's the fun thing about publishing. They change the title of your book so then you never remember
it. They do
right.
do that.
Right. You're
Good
like,
for you, Andrea. I'd love to get it. I'd love to buy a copy of that.
I think it just came out in paperback maybe like a year ago, which is like a big deal in academic. Well, now everyone goes straight to paperback, but mine went to hardback. It was in the early days. And so I was so excited. And then earlier, like in maybe March or something, they sent me a coupon code and then I shared it with everyone. It was like, I'll try to find it. I'll try to find it, but then you can even save a little more money so it's more affordable.
Thank
you.
Wonderful.
Send it to all of us so that we can get it.
Yeah, that's necessary things.
All right. Well, it looks like we're at the top of the hour. we're currently broadcasting. We're live, or I guess live. So welcome everyone to the Focus St. Louis conversation about the 19th Amendment. We're celebrating years of the right for women to vote. My name is Shayla Ford, and I serve as the Director of Emerging Leaders and Youth Leadership at Focus St. Louis. We're glad that you joined us today, and joining me, we have an esteemed group of women who are rock stars in their own right, who are going to have this conversation with me. So I'll introduce our panelists, I'll kind of frame out what we're going to do today, and then we'll jump right in. So our first panelist is Jean Peters Baker, who is the chairwoman of the Missouri Democratic Party. Welcome, Jean. Next, we have Dr. Andrea Benjamin, who is the Associate Professor of African and African American Studies at the University of Oklahoma. And I have to give you big props because I have my bachelor's degree in African and Africana Studies from the University of Minnesota. So thank you for joining us, Dr. Benjamin. And I'll call them by their first names as we go through the conversation. And last but certainly not least, we have Dr. Nancy Miller, who is co-president of the League of Women Voters here in St. Louis. So welcome, Nancy, and welcome to all of our panelists and to our audience who's joining us. We're very excited to have this thoughtful conversation. When the conversation came up with the focus team about this particular topic, and then I was invited to host. So this is my first gig as the moderator. Thank you, Wally, for inviting me to participate. I thought about how do we start this conversation? How do I want to frame it? And what I thought about was a trip that I took 20 years ago. Can you believe 21, right? To Ghana, West Africa. And I came across a symbol known as the Sankofa. And the Sankofa is a metaphorical bird whose symbol looks like a bird with its head turning to its back. And it's grabbing an egg, depending on how intricate the design or the picture is that you see. But that is associated with a proverb, and so I'm going to read it to you so that I don't mess it up. It is not wrong to go back for that which you have forgotten. And it expresses the importance of reaching back to knowledge gained in the past and bringing it into the present in order to make positive progress. And that's what I think about this 100 years. Let's look back to gain the knowledge that maybe we've forgotten or the lessons that were learned at that time, and really think about how it can impact a positive progress for the future. There's so much work still to be done. We've come a long way, but there's much work to do. So our conversation today is to really highlight the importance of the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. It is a hard-won civil right, and it has an impact today that's far-reaching, but there's, again, still more work to do. So we're going to explore the importance of what it meant within the happening in the early 19th century as well, or 20th century, and then what does it mean for now? So I've centered some of those questions around some themes. And what I want to invite our audience to do is use the chat function to comment on some of the conversation that we're having and or to ask questions. There will be a specific Q&A time, and I'll let you know when that is in case you're like, I'm thinking of the questions, but write them down now. Get a pen, take some paper to take some notes so that we can have some rich questions from the audience as well. So ladies, are you ready to get started? I'm going to kick us off with our first question. It's around the theme of just kind of historical context and personal insights. So 100 years, when we think about it, is a very long time, but it's also no time at all when you think about the history of the country and how long we've been in existence. But by this, we mean that the generations have really understood the universal right to vote as something that women have had for a very long time. But we know that there's still more work to do, and it's historical fact, but it's also a current event. So I'd like each of you to share with us a few thoughts about how women have shown up over electoral history in this country and how they're showing up currently. And why don't I start with Jean? You have a stab at that, and then I'll kind of round robin to the rest of our panelists. But Jean, tell us what your thoughts are about that question.
My thoughts are that women have always been an important part of the electorate, even before having the right to vote, because I think women had a large influence on the voter in their home. But you know, how dismissive, right? You know, to consider that as some kind of participation, because it is not. So what we know now, though, with women having the right to vote, is that women vote in large numbers compared to our male counterparts, at least in the 2018 election, and this has been true in all the previous 5 midterm elections. 53% of voters were women, where 47% were men. So in the game of politics, that's significant. That is that's a little gap that we should all take notice of. What that means is women are more heavily engaged and more likely to go out to vote than their male counterparts. So there may be a variety of reasons for that, that maybe have very little to do with R&D kind of politics, but have to do with issues that are very important to women and families, and what we look for, I think, is different. And then beyond that, beyond our showing up to vote in greater numbers and in practically all categories, that's true for women. But this is also true. And I say now, I'm speaking as a office holder in a public office. Women are far more likely to sit down at a table and negotiate an outcome. They're just women by nature. This is a generality. Okay, you can always find an example where there's an elected female that doesn't share this kind of quality. But in general, women are collaborators, and we form partnerships, and we find middle ground, and we're pretty good at that. We have a skill set at that, and that's why I personally made it my job to recruit as many women as I could to run for public office in 2020.
Okay, thank you. Why don't we go to Andrea next? What are some of your thoughts about where we find ourselves 100 years from the passing of the 19th Amendment?
Sure. I mean, I think I echo a lot of what Jean said, and especially when we think about Black women vote at a very high rate. And so we have continued to be engaged. I think thinking about it, though, you know, women are, you know, to build on what Jean said, women are also just more likely to think about politics as more than voting. And so even when we think about that it was so important for the 19th Amendment to pass, it's not as if women weren't super active in politics prior to that. They just engaged in the way that the law allowed. And I think we see that today, right? That women are willing to, you know, really do that on the ground work, door knocking, right? Calling, text banking, phone banking, right? That for them, politics is, you know, obviously voting and maybe even running for office. We've seen an increase in that. But if you ask women, they'll say, oh yeah, I just wanted to solve this problem. My community had this problem, so I got to work, right? And so really thinking broadly about it. And so even when there have been barriers to us voting, it has never been a barrier for us to participate in politics, so.
Okay, I love that. Thank you for sharing that. Nancy, what's your perspective?
Well, looking back,
100 years ago, in 1848, more than 100 years ago, that's when the first declaration was made about women's independence. You know, why are we still ruled by men? When Jefferson, you know, bought where we live and moved in the British law, we lost our right to divorce, our right to own property, to work and keep our own money, to have any say, to have an inheritance. Those were all gone. The French gave us those, but they all left when Jefferson came in. So it's been a long time that women have been saying, why can't we do that when other people do that? First active thing that women really got involved in this country was abolition, being in favor of that and going on the stump with the women who'd made it out of the South and come north. And then we had the issue of the temperance union mixed with the slavery, and women through our history up still till now have always been willing to come out and make some noise and let their voices be heard when it mattered to them. Since this is just a little tidbit, since January of 2016, whatever happened then, the League of Women Voters has more than doubled in membership. We're almost to 3 times now what it was at that point in time. And that's because women today want to do something. They want to participate. They want to make their voices heard. So this is just, you know, it's what we do. And often we are very good at it. We get things done. We're the ones who got bread sliced back in the 20s, the 1920s. That was one of the early tenets. They wanted bread to be more hygienic and sliced because you used to just go buy this loaf of bread. And they got the law passed that it had to be put inside a paper bag and it needed to be sliced so children wouldn't play with knives. So, yay.
I was going to say, interesting, you know, public health, safety, and then convenience for your home and your family, right? So I like that because I think it kind of wraps into what the other women said. Voting was not just about a convenience, but really about practicality and how we live our lives. You know, and if I were to use saying from today, like, how do we live our best lives? And women from back then, that they were always trying to live their best lives. Nancy, you said something that I want to kind of go into the next question. You talked about women wanting their voices to be heard. And so what I found kind of doing research for this is that there was something called the silent suffragist. Really, they used protest as an act of silent resistance. And so, you know, your voice being heard, but using silence as your voice. And so what I'd like about, you know, when we think about 100 years ago or a little more, because the protests that the women did were about 2.5 years, but then you kind of situate against the current state where we're having protests in the streets that are continuing, and not just women, but women, men, and a diverse group, Black, white, different, you know, orientation, whatever. Like, there's a diverse group of people that are protesting today because there's something that they believe and there's something that they want. They want to be heard. So is anybody willing to talk about the parallels between movements and using protest, and that women were the first to protest silently in front of the White House, and they did it for 2.5 years? There was consequence for that, and I guess I don't want to leave that out, but the consequence was gross brutality towards women, beatings. They were arrested. They were force-fed when they did hunger strikes, when they were contained in jail, and later that was found unconstitutional. But there was a lot that had to that people had to endure to get us to where we are. But what, if anybody wants to jump in, what do you think about the parallels of protests back then to make a movement and a statement, and the protests that we see today? All right, Nancy.
And I'll just start it off because St. Louis is very famous for the Golden Lane. In 1916, the Democratic Convention was being held here. And so the call went out through all the women's groups through the country to come to St. Louis. We're going to make a stand and convince the Democrats to put suffrage on their platform for the upcoming presidential elections. Over 2,000 women showed up, and between the hotel and the convention arena, they lined both sides of the streets wearing white dresses, wearing sashes, coats for women, and carrying yellow umbrellas. And they stood silently and watched as the men came out of the hotel some of them walking, some of them in carriages, some riding horses, and just stood and stared at them. It took 2 hours for them to stand and just be there. And then when all the men were inside, they went inside after them and paraded around and sang a couple of their favorite songs, and then they left. And that, you know, that to me is, if you have an image today when you watch TV with the young folks mostly out there, which is wonderful, with their arms up, I'm just thinking about, think of the ladies with their umbrellas up standing there, just staring. And it's just so poignant. I just love it. I think it's great.
Thank you. Jean, what about you? Any thoughts that you would like to add?
Many thoughts about.
Okay.
There are parallels. This is a very different movement that we're in now, and it is vitally important. And I don't want to draw the parallel as if they are equal in all ways. They are not. It is. But I think here's a parallel that is important to remark about, is that we do take for granted, especially those who are just innately have this power. You take it for granted that that others had to fight for the marker that you're on today, and that even when you're dissatisfied with that marker, someone before you fought for you to have the marker you're on today. And so there is a disconnect, I think, and that's kind of what's showing up today, this disconnect of scores of people, taking to the streets to be heard, and others, kind of being jarred by it, thinking, why are so many people upset? Well, it is it's an important moment that we're in right now, but it's also for women. I think the 2016 election was a reckoning for women. I think many of us did not think that we felt like we went back in time, and people didn't believe that would happen, and they didn't believe it could happen. That the interest of women would be put in sort of this different category. And the other thing I want to say about that is, in my job as a prosecutor, I've had odd reminders over time of how slow change does come. So when I worked in sex crimes as an assistant prosecutor, I got a series of what we called cold cases that occurred maybe in the 1980s and 1990s that DNA solved, and then I was trying the case in the mid 2000s. When you get the jury instructions, that's the actual law that I have to prove each element in order to make my case beyond a reasonable doubt. One of the elements that I've had to prove on these cold cases is that the victim, the rape victim in the case, was not married to her offender at the time. And of course, it was a stranger case. She could not have even identified him. But that was an element that I had to prove, because the law protected husbands with rape of their wives, wait for it, until 1991 in the state of Missouri. That did not change until 1991. And it's rather shocking to me that that's a really recent history.
Right.
But there are other issues like that the law is really slow to change, even though the public is clamoring for it.
Okay, good, thank you. Andrea, I'll let you add if you would like to before I go on to the next question, which I'll also probably stay with you. I want to talk about some of the suffragists of color. But
I'll keep this really short. I mean, I think to Jean's point, I mean, the law is not always current, right? I think that's what you're trying to say, right? And so we think about, well, why are people protesting today? They should just go vote. But guess what, y'all? It has been an active voter suppression campaign for a while now. And look at what happened yesterday in Kentucky, right? People were trying to vote, and it was very difficult. So the issues, they're still there. There are still barriers. And so, you might try something a couple of times. Hey, here's a petition. Hey, here's some comments. Hey, we want to change this thing. But eventually, right, you're going to come to a point where you say, you haven't heard me. Right. And so we see that in the past, right, that women saying, see me, because you're not listening.
Right. Exactly.
Right. And I think that's what we're seeing here today.
Right. Thank you. Some interesting thoughts that you shared that I'll continue to kind of spin in my head and let me reflect even after the panel is done. I think it's important, you know, we think about the 19th Amendment, and again, I kind of started off thinking that folks have this thought that, you know, it was total universal suffrage for all women, but it was not. And so, although the way that it was stated in the amendment doesn't lead you to think that, you know, women would somehow be left out, but there was a group of women that were left out. Native American women or indigenous people, Black women, Asian women. And so, one, we know that it didn't cover everyone. So there's a question there that I kind of want Andrea to start with, but also in the movement itself, history usually only shows us a few prominent women, and those happen to be white women. And there's nothing wrong with that, but like, let's be more inclusive. Let's cast the net wider and really understand the numbers of women, women of color and kind of who have been unseen, but they were really critical. And so maybe we can talk a little bit about why the 19th Amendment didn't cover, you know, all women, and then talk a little bit about maybe those names that we haven't heard or we don't know. So I'll start with Andrea, and then I'll circle around to everyone else.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think it's clear that even though, you know, we think about it, okay, so it was 100 years ago that women got the right to vote. Black people haven't really been able to vote freely for 100 years, right? So we already know, right, that the Voting Rights Act didn't come till 1964, I want to say, don't quote me, my history, that sounds right. But, right, so then there's still a gap there, right? And so even though when women were allowed to vote, the barriers that particularly African Americans, but let alone Native Americans, Indigenous peoples, Asian Americans, Latinx people, whether it was the, you know, the literacy tests, right, that no one can pass. Sometimes when I teach, I'll give the Alabama is like the most notorious test and no one can pass it. So there were still barriers, or even just having a poll tax, right? That there's an actual tax that you have to pay that's a barrier to voting. So we know that that is, that still existed for women of color in particular. And I think for me, you know, one of the greatest joys, you know, you mentioned that I teach in African and African American studies now. The greatest joy that I had even this semester, the spring semester, was I taught Intro to African American Studies. And it's a class I hadn't taken since college because I double majored. And so you know, I only took it once and then I hadn't taught it. So this was my first time. And, you know, I told my students on day one, you're going to learn about a lot of people that you've never heard of, but you're also going to learn about a lot of Black women. Like, this class is going to be that. And so, of course, I've gotten a lot of emails since class ended. I'm so glad. But I think if I were to say the women of color that I think of that were really just, even in my undergraduate career that, you know, I try to take classes on, obviously you can't move forward without thinking of Anna Julia Cooper, right? So The Voice from the South, which really centers women in a political movement. And, you know, when I think about her life, right, you know, her, and there's a couple of her cohort that must have, you know, they went to college, right? And so they're educated and they use their, you know, these abilities, they're writing, and they really engage with the public in a way that we think maybe like old school social media, right? They did these newsletters and they're like writing all this stuff for people. And so I think of her, and I think of, you know, the African American Women's Church movement, right? So Mary Church Terrell comes out of that group. Obviously Ida B. Wells, right? So again, we think about these people who, again, they're heavily engaged in politics, right? Because Ida B. Wells spent her whole career trying to bring attention to lynching, right? Through these newsletters, through the NAACP, right? That these are ways. And so when I think about these women and like being able to share these with students who say, I've never heard these women's names, right? But again, it's just a reminder that even when the barriers were there for women and Black women to vote, these women of color generally, but these Black women really spent their time, right, just trying to still engage in politics, still try to bring change in the only way that they knew how, and that they were able to, right? So again, to Jean's earlier point, you know, the law was clear, so we found a workaround, right?
You know, I'll toss it back up to you. Any folks that you want, women that you want to name and or, you know, respond kind of to that limited victory. I'm calling it limited because it's still not fully realized by all women.
I'd like to make sure we remember Annie Malone in St. Louis.
Okay.
She was a wonderful influence. She was a chemist who decided that Black women deserved to have makeup, just like everybody else. And so she went out of her way. That's what she did. She developed makeup of all kinds, got the stores to sell it, got people to buy it. You know, that was a big step. And then she used that money to support other African American efforts. Right now, we still have the children's home. It's a big deal. We have the Annie Malone Parade. The Black community really supports every year still. A woman named Gwen B. Giles, who was the first African American senator. She was very important for women becoming involved, to say, you can do this. You can come to the U.S. Senate. You can do this. Well, she was in the Missouri Senate. Missed that. And then we have, I would like to say the name, throw in the name right now, the woman who was, her name was Beatrice Grady. And she was very active in the 1920s. She was a suffragist. She led the women who were in the Chicago parade, I believe. And then after the vote was passed, then she had a colored women's club, and they joined with the League of Women Voters. So then there was a colored division within the League of Women Voters. And then she joined into the leadership. She joined the board so that they would involve more women. And, these, of course, there weren't too many because they didn't have the free time. Most of the suffragettes were a group of fairly well-off women. If they had kids, they could afford a nanny. If they didn't have kids, they could afford, somebody was paying for them to live. So it was a precious group. But the Black women who were out there doing this were doing above and beyond what everybody else was. But they didn't stop. They kept going.
Right. Jean, why don't you tell us some of the people you would like us to remember, either historically or current day, that are helping this movement for the voting?
Yes, thank you for that, Shayla. I think for me, Shirley Chisholm was important because it was just a face you got to see, and she was in Congress, throughout my life. And so it was important as a kid just to see her and see how she looked. She looked different. So to me, she was an important figure. And if she gave it to me, she must have given it to a variety of other women as well, that she can do it. Look, she made it. It is possible, and we need her. So it's just important to see those faces. I think, I also would like to underscore the number of women that were on the stage for presidential candidates for the Democratic Party this year. It was striking, and it was significant. And while that election did not merit a win for one of them, it put women on a different stage. It just flatly did. I think the world has changed. This election cycle has changed women's role, and we're not going to go back. We're not going to go back. So there won't be a female president in 2020, but I pray there will be a female vice president in 2020. And so I'm excited to see what happens there, and it puts women on a whole new stage that we have not had before. I think it's important also, another recent name is Michelle Obama. Just such a classy, amazing, beautiful, all the perfection that she brought to that job. Unfortunate that she had to bring perfection so that she could demonstrate just a baseline of competence for it. But that demonstrates what we've been talking about, and that is, the 19th Amendment, when it did come 100 years ago, it did not come to all, and I think we should just call that what it is. It's racism, and it's important to call it out when we see it, and that's what it was 100 years ago, that it was okay to negotiate out a little win for some women, and it was because of racism that was achieved.
Right. Thank you for your comments. I want to say some more names, and then I'll move to the next question, because I'm starting now to see some of those questions. Anna Julia Cooper, and what I'd like the audience to do, and Wally, you can type them in the chat, take these names down, Google them, because I'm not going to give you like what they've done, but they're names you should know. Mabel Ping Lee, Adelina Okra Warren, Frances Elaine Watkins Harper, Mary Ann Shad with 2 Ds, Sophia Reyes de Vera, and I might be saying the name incorrectly, Nanine Helen Burrows, and of course, Mary Church Terrell, and there's numbers of others. But it's important that we say their names, we remember their names, and we kind of, again, for the purpose of looking back, to remember what knowledge we had from the past to move forward. So the question I want to go to now, especially since Jean mentioned women candidates, you know, what are some of the unique challenges that women candidates face? And if we're, you know, kind of like your hope for, your aspiration that if it's not in this presidential election based on what we know now, but in the next cycle after this, what are the challenges that women face running for office or being in the public servant space?
I guess I can start there. It's a really harsh business. It's harsh. It's mean. So you have to have a toughness and a resolve. You have to be careful that you don't allow people to pierce your personhood, I guess, because it's really when people can critique you through any means necessary and sign their name anonymous, you're going to get some really vile things are going to be said about you. And that's one thing for the candidate. It's another thing for the candidate's family. And then for others who watch, who think, wow, I do not want to sign up for that. And that's fair. But we need people who are willing to sign up for that. And we need people to understand that's the world that we live in now. And it's the way politics. I don't think we get to go back to a more genteel way of campaigning. And I'll even say this, I've made a joke about this before, and it kind of disturbs people who know me, but it's the only way I know how to deal with this, that even death threats that come to me in my job as prosecutor have been underscored with the sexism that I find extra vile. And, you know, I have to kind of joke about it because it's just the way it is. But, you know, I have, on one case I handled, my secretary was just a sweet, lovely person who really did love me, had to receive the call about the caller said this group was going to capture me, gang rape me, and then kill me. And my joke had been, really, my male counterpart, did you threaten to rape him as well? Or was it you're just going to go right to, you know, killing him? So it's just, I will say, that's not funny, and I don't mean it to be funny, but there is, that's what you're going to encounter. And you have to, you got to make sure that you got a space in your life that you can protect yourself from that you can protect yourself from just the, you know, that you don't allow that stuff to harm you, so that you will go about and do your job and be a public servant and do the best job that you know how to do. You know, admit when you made mistakes, try and correct those, but then continue to lean into the job. Don't be fearful, you know, lean in and do it, because there's more good people out there than bad.
Thank you for sharing that. That's a personal story that I think is a side of the work that you do that many people probably don't think about. And so I think it does really, you know, help us understand that when you decide to hold an office, a public office, that there's another side, that there's a sacrifice. My grandmother would have told me that that's how you count the cost before you make decisions. And even if the cost is high, the sacrifice is always still worth it. So thank you for sharing your story. And I hope that other listening realize that, yes, there is a cost to serving others and to speaking out for what's right and for getting things done. But the sacrifice is so much more worth it. And when we think about the end result and what that impact and influence will be for others in our community, I think about my son. I don't want him to grow up in a world where, you know, his life is threatened because of who he is, rather than, you know, having the right to just live freely and be. Yeah. So Andrea, do you want to jump in, and then Nancy will come to you on kind of this question about some of the challenges that women face
Nancy can go. I think she was
Okay,
ready.
go ahead, Nancy.
One thing that I always try and stress is that it's up to us, all of us, to remember that as we go through our careers, whatever they would be, and I'm an educator by my career, the one before where I actually made some money, that our job is to bring up the next generation. Our job is to be mentors to the young women before come after us, that we make it our job, part of our job, to see who is a leader, who is interested, who would be the kind of person that everyone would say, she's doing the right thing, she's in the right place, we need her there. You notice I'm saying her, because the men always get lots of mentoring. It's just so important to remember, and I try and tell the women, where are your granddaughters? Where are your daughters? Have you talked to them lately? What are they doing? Do they know what you're doing? We have to bring them along. We have to show them, it's the old adage, you don't learn from what someone says, you learn from what they do. We have to show them what we have to do. And then when things get tough, we have to be there to give them a phone call and say, I heard about this, and I'm really sorry it happened, but there's no basis for it. You're better than this. And you just have to take a deep breath and stand up and say, okay, I can go another day if that's what it takes. And, no matter what the job is. And I think sometimes when we get to a certain position in life, we think, well, okay, we're done with that. It's time for bridge. No, it's not like that. Our responsibilities go on. It. Man once said at our church, I remember, there's no retirement in the Bible. What?
Yeah.
And that's something I've heard in my head ever since, because we're called to keep going. And women, women are relationships, men are rules. You've all heard that. It's always true. It's going to be true. And we have to support each other. And sometimes we just need to remind each other that that's what we're supposed to be doing. We're supposed to be doing that, and congratulating and buoying each other up, and it's just so important.
Thank you. We're getting ready to move into our time with the audience. So if anyone has questions specifically to the entire panel or a specific panelist, please start putting your questions on the chat. We'll try to get to as many as we can. But I have a question before me that talks about, and maybe Jean, you can start us off. It says, yesterday, the Missouri Supreme Court handed down a decision for voting in Missouri. Can we talk about what that means?
So that is going to continue through the court process. And so it's significant, though, because what we're talking about is a voting rights measure here. Whether or not people can safely vote is critical, and we have to do all we can to support individuals' right to vote. And right now, safely, a safe right to vote. I do have a lot of faith and trust in the judicial process. I think the judicial process tends to get it right, and that is where the world becomes far less political, and it's really about what's the best public policy. And so I have to believe in that this notary requirement will not stand, that individuals would have the right to vote by absentee ballot. In lots of states, by the way, there's an early voting provision. We do not have that in Missouri, and it's foolish that we do not have an early voting provision. There you can state no good public policy why we do not have this provision. So I pray that Missouri is going to lean into that new voting right in the future. Right now, the best we can hope for is an absentee ballot system that's safe and fair. And but in the future, and I pray the very near future, we're going to talk about other voting provisions that help the electorate.
Okay, Nancy, I saw you raise your hand, so let's.
Yes, we have an update. The Missouri Supreme Court ruled late yesterday, that decision by the circuit court saying upholding the necessity of the notary on the absentee ballots, et cetera, the mail-in was unnecessary, and he sent that back to the circuit court. So there's a good chance that, we think there's a good chance, you know, we were one of the groups that brought the lawsuit, that that notarization is removed, at least for this year. I mean, and that's a beginning. That's a beginning. We would like to see mail-in voting become what we do, but that's a way off in Missouri. But this is a good decision yesterday, and we are just trusting that it will continue, because it, you know, we all know what a difference it makes. So the court's doing some good things.
Okay. Okay, thanks. We have another question that is that says, what is the advice that you would give fathers to support their daughters in activism and/or in politics? So we've got some dads that want to know, how do they support their daughters? Who would like to take a stab at that? Andrea? No, she's like, nope. Maybe Nancy. Why don't you take a stab at it? Perhaps
Sure.
some education information that you could share.
Well, I think it's just saying good job. You know, the first march back in 16, I've got a bad hip and I can't march. So I drove the car and picked people up and took them around and that kind of thing. But my husband marched with my daughter. And one of my favorite pictures is the two of them holding the League of Women Voters banner as they march down. And then other friends. And, you know, that's just something that's always going to be there for both of them. And that's what fathers, I tell my sons, you know, this is your job. Your job is to support your family, and not just with money. You know, you have to be behind them. You're their rock. You know, good job. You know, I may not agree with you all the time, but I support your right to have an opinion, a belief, and that you really think something's important and you want to do it. That's just, you know, that has to be, I shouldn't say that. That should be the way that dads look at it. You know, my dad was one of those silent dads, you know, he'd kind of go nod and go, mm-hmm. But that's okay. He didn't say, well, that's really stupid. You know, I mean, it's just, there's so many ways dads can support their kids, and they're good. And dads today are so much more active in their kids' lives. I look for a lot more dads to be supporting their daughters. It's great.
I'd like to add to that, if you don't mind, if you have a moment, if you have a moment for that. I think the way dads support daughters is by supporting their wives who run for office and are part of the team. You know, explain to their kids, you know, that they believe in mom. Mom can do this, and it's just through doing. It's through doing, and making it a normal thing. That it's oddly normal in my house. So. Not that any of my kids want to have anything to do with running for public office. However, you never know. Things may change for them, and they have had an opportunity to witness their father support their mother.
Thank you for adding that. I want to add in for dads and moms. What I do as a mom, well, actually, we vote as a family in my household. So my husband and I, we get up and go early in the morning on voting day to a school that's around the corner. We take our son with us. This past year, I was not able to take my son, and it was funny because they know us and they're like, where's your son at? What happened? And I said, well, he's at home. I'm kind of running late and I got to get into work. So I kind of came by myself today. They'll be here later, but it becomes something that's part of your family commitment, part of your way of doing something as a family. So my son knows because he comes with me to the polls. And at some point, we'll start talking more about, like, what are the critical issues? What are the things that we value as a family? And who are those candidates that most align with the things we value? So I would encourage dads to, you know, take the kids to the polls with you, or go as a family, and then talk about the issues. Again, it's not about agreement as much as we have the open dialogue. We have the trust and the care for one another to hear our points of view, but that we encourage that we vote. I know it's been something important for me for a very long time, because I know the shoulders on who I stand, and that someone died, literally died, you know, for me to have that right. And I need to, it's no longer a duty. It is my pleasure to make sure that I'm out voting every single time in every single election, presidential on down to local. And that's what I do. So I think it's your example. that makes that happen. So Andrea, there's questions coming through, lots of questions. I see a couple that are specific to you, and one says, you pay a lot of attention to Black participation in local elections. Have you noticed any important differences by gender in your data?
Yeah, that's such a good question. Really, to piggyback off what you're saying, I'm like an advocate for voting in all elections, right? So local politics is so unique in that it's election day almost every day somewhere, right? Somewhere someone is deciding something at the local level. And so to your point, like making sure that you show up more than just every 4 years or even every 2 years, right? That you engage with your local politics, your school boards, your county commission, your city council, those types of things. And I think what's unique about local politics is that women are often, this is the level at which they're willing to run, right? And so we see, city councils that are majority women. We see a diverse set of city councils, although they're not as diverse as we want them to be. But yeah, it's similar in terms of turnout in that women, Black women especially, are much more likely to participate in these elections as well. And so I think, when we think about sort of how do we end up going back earlier to 2020 sort of Democratic primary starting looking like this is the best it's ever been. Look at us. Two, right? Still, it's just going to be two white dudes. There is some disappointment. And I did write something for the Washington Post about what we could do to maybe diversify, to change that, but that's neither here nor there, right? But to say that the pipeline has to be there, right? And so the pipeline comes from, I don't know, you served as a city council member, you did county commission, you did that, then maybe you ran for something, state senate, house, then now we're talking about our pipeline, right? Because as much as I want there to be zero barriers to running for office, there are plenty of barriers, right? And I think, again, you're going to face sexism if you're a woman. You're going to face sexism and racism if you're a woman of color. There's going to be other, you think about Anise Parker running for mayor to be the first lesbian mayor of Houston. She faced barriers, right? So there's barriers, right. But it's also a skill that you can build, right? And you can toughen up and you fundraise, you learn how to do all those things. And so we need to strengthen our pipeline, and it starts in local politics. It's disappointing that women had to, Elizabeth Warren is like a champion of many things. If you had, if she was still running and we had maybe picked her, I feel like I will know, if you're elected day one, I know it. These 10 things that you are actually going to do. She was so detailed, so clear, so you knew that she had done her research on the policies, and that still wasn't enough, right? So sexism is still very real. So to to a dad, to a family, challenge your own sexism in your home, right? Because it's coming from somewhere and it's being replicated everywhere, right? And so how can we challenge those ideas? It's not going to change tomorrow. I get that. But eventually, right? If you have kids, I don't want my kids 2050 to be like, we're still facing sexism, right? Like, it would be nice, racism, it would be nice to know that we had maybe lessened it. I don't know if we can get rid of it right there. There was just less. I don't know. So maybe that's a long answer to the question.
I think it's great though, because you bring up some of those things. And I liked earlier, Jean's like, call it out. If it's racism, call it out. If it's sexism, call it out. If whatever it is, let's call it out, because then we're able and more apt and more empowered to address it and deal with it. We don't get to be silent and sweep it under the rug and act as if it doesn't exist. It's still very front and center in what we experience as women and women of color in this world, regardless if you office or not, regardless, in your everyday career. I think we all probably could point back to a time that we could speak to being challenged because of who we are, because of our gender. And then if you have the intersection of, your gender and your race, there's kind of a double whammy, unfortunately. So that's important that you brought that up. We've got time for a couple of more questions, and there was one, and now I'm trying to see if I can go back. Someone wanted to ask Nancy specifically, oh my goodness, now can I go back to it? Nancy specifically about one of the league's founders, St. Louis and Edna Gellhorn, or Gellhorn.
Yeah.
Okay.
Gellhorn. Yes,
okay.
She was a wonderful, wonderful lady. She was just so important in the suffrage movement. And then when the vote came, they asked her to go and be president of the national organization. She said, no, I want to stay in Missouri. And so she stayed in Missouri and was first president in Missouri's league. And then she was from St. Louis. So then She stayed in St. Louis and was with the St. Louis League for like 25 years. Her granddaughter came to our 100th anniversary celebration last November.
Wow.
Got to talk to her. She is a public defender in Washington, D.C.
Wow.
I mean, it's just, you know, it's just so exciting. This is, not only was she a real person, but we got to meet her granddaughter. But she was one of those women. And she also, come to think of it, the gal who was the African-American gal, she was, Gellhorn was, they used to meet in hotels, you know, in ballrooms back then. And she was, they were going to a meeting, and one of the hotel employees came out and said, I'm sorry, but you can't go up. And Edna said, what do you mean? She said, well, those women. And she pointed to the African-American gals. And Edna said, well, that's not going to work. And she said, well, that's our policy. And Edna said, well, that's not going to work. We're leaving. So she called off the meeting and they left. And they never went back to that hotel. You know, even back then, very principled people were involved in this whole movement, have been all these years. You know, we don't stop. But she was just great, important to St. Louis. Thank you for bringing it up, whoever did.
Yes, thank you. That's good history. I love some of the history lessons that we're learning. There's another comment that came in, and I don't think it's really, well, it's a comment and a question. Someone commented that, you know, in case the current decision is upheld and you need to have your absentee ballots notarized, that she's going to move forward to become a notary. But her question is, should we be preparing for that? So like, what is our strategy? We need more than one strategy, because we don't want to, you know, have something backfire. We know that at this time, if nothing else, excuse me, and a global pandemic has taught us that, you know, as new information comes, we have to pivot, we have to be agile, we have to adjust as new information is available. And so we're hopeful by the decision that we heard about yesterday. If that's not the case, what do we need to be doing? So does any of you suggest that people become
We
notarized?
have a new notary corps,
Okay.
along with our coalition partners in the Voters Protection Coalition. We have a group forming. They're oh yes, they're well on the way. If you want to look at our probably just send something to our email, probably lwvstl.org.
Okay. Okay.
LWVSTL gets you into the website, you know, email, that kind of stuff. At gmail.com, I should say that, I'm sorry, lwvstl@gmail.com. And then we can link you to the group that's forming. They're going. So
that sounds really good. And we'll make sure that if it can either be in the chat, or we'll follow up on the email and let people know, because I think that that's another strategy that, you know, maybe folks need to, you know, join the corps, so that if we need to still notarize those ballots, we can get that done, because
we get about one call a day asking for what can I do on that. So
okay, yep. Good. Excuse me, my voice is a little choppy all of a sudden. I'm going to move us into our final call to action round, because we're getting ready to wrap up. And so I wanted to start that with this quote that I found, and it seems so relevant today. And again, I'm going to look at it so that I don't mess it up. But in 1911, Anna Howard Shaw said, "The old battle cries no longer stir our souls. Give us a new banner for our time. Let us have new leaders. And what we need most undoubtedly is a new battle cry to stir the dormant souls of American men and women." So I ask you, as kind of a final thought and remark, give us a call to action. What is your call to actions? What will stir our souls to continue to move this fight forward, and to not relent? So Jean, why don't I start with you? What would be your call to action for this audience?
You know, it's really based more on our current moment. And my fear is that people will tire and they'll want to go home. And it's critical that people stay in this fight, if you want to call it that, stay in this moment. And particularly, this sometimes offends people, but I've said it before, I'm going to say it again, particularly to white people, you need to stay in this fight. You cannot go home until you have seen the kind of change that all of our citizens deserve and want, and that we must support. So when one is down, we're all down. So in 1920, when we got the 19th Amendment ratified, that was great for me and Nancy, right? But it wasn't great for our other panelists. So that's not good enough. So we can't go home on something short of not good enough. So my battle cry is, don't go home. It's not time.
Okay. Thank you. Andrea, what's your call to action for us?
Sure. A couple of things. One is just make sure your voter registration is current, and find 5 friends and make sure it's current for them too. If voting by mail becomes an option in your state, choose to exercise that, right? So that you don't have to put your own health at risk to be able to participate in November. And I would say if you have the resources, like, you don't have to love the presidential candidates, you don't have to want to engage at that level, but there are people down ballot in your state, in my state, that they need a donation. They need it bad. They needed it yesterday, right? So who's running for Congress in your state? Who's running for your state Senate, your state House? They're all up for reelection, your sheriff, local elections. And if you have the privilege to have any sort of extra income, find a couple of those people, make a donation to them. Your money will go a long way. If you have time, volunteer for them, phone bank, text bank, get a lawn sign, I don't know, right? Just like do all the things that you can do safely within your comfort and within your means. But even if you don't have any money, like I said, those down ballot candidates, we have to show up for them if for no other reason. Again, you don't have to love what's going on at the top. I know it's what's getting all the attention, but there are a lot of elections in the next couple of months. Engage with them.
Thank you. Thank you. Nancy, what's action for us?
Oh, there's so much to do. You know, your time, your talents, of course, your money. We all need money, especially in this time we haven't been able to hold our fundraisers. That your vote, you know, we have to vote. We have to take others to vote with us. That's not going to end. We haven't stopped in 100 years. We're not going to stop. But we can always use help. And if, we can always direct you to somewhere else. If there's something that somebody else is doing that matches what you want to do, we're in coalition with like 30 other groups. So get involved. You know, it's what we all need to do. Remember, August 4th, vote yes, Medicaid expansion. End of my plug. We don't go for, I'm sorry, we don't support parties or candidates. We support issues. But we certainly support the process. That's what makes it happen. So let's all get involved.
Thank you, women. Thank you, Jean. Thank you, Nancy. Thank you, Andrea, for a really thoughtful and thought-provoking conversation with me today. I loved your call to action. Don't quit. Get involved. So I want our audience to know: do not quit. Tell your friends, don't quit. Can't get tired. If you need to take a break, it's okay, but you get back up and you keep it moving, right? If you're not registered, register folks to vote, and then make sure you go to the polls. And I love it. It is really about voting your values. So you know your personal values, you know your family values, whatever those are, that's what you vote. We're not here to tell you which candidate, but you know what your values are and they align with you. So we thank you for joining us for this conversation, and I'd kind of like to wrap it up and close it with kind of how I started. Remember that visual or that story of the Sankofa. It's okay to look back, to regain the forgotten knowledge and the lessons, and let's use those lessons to propel us forward in a progressive, positive way that means real change for not just our region, but for our nation. And women have always been at the forefront, whether they were recognized for it or not. So women will continue to lead the way. And so I just encourage us all, let's step out, let's step up, let's continue to lead as we've always done. Thank you for your time today, and follow-up email with some of the links to our speakers and some of the names of those that sometimes history forgets to mention. So thank you for the time today. Have a great one. We're going to sign off now. Thank you again, ladies, for the time. Bye-bye.